must be cautious.
Welcome to the Nerd Party.
Hi, this is Nick Anastasiou, story editor on Star Wars The Clone Wars and Star Wars Bad Batch. And you are listening to Aggressive Negotiations.
That's right, it's Aggressive Negotiations, the Star Wars podcast, hosted here on the Nerd Party Network, that is your guide to the deep, dark crevices of all the things that you wondered about the thematic and story elements of the Star Wars saga, but were not afraid to ask, except occasionally when you realize that the question might have somebody give you answers that you didn't want. But that's what we're here for. I am John Mills. And I am joined once more by my esteemed colleague, Jedi Master Matthew Rushing, the keeper of the secret and the guardian of the flame. How are you doing, Matt? And are you excited for tonight's surprise topic?
I am more than excited about tonight's topic. As they would say on Friends, could I be more excited? Yep. You know, I'm ready. I always love when you just pull something out of your nether regions and ask me a question that I'm not expecting. So
that's true. I pull it out of the nebula left and right. And what I would love to pull out of the nebula is some new ratings and reviews on Apple Podcasts. We would really appreciate it. It helps us. We do this for the love of the game. Look, let's face it. Podcasting, unless you're a very famous person, doesn't really have you rolling in the dough. So we're doing it for the love of the game. So let us know if you love the way we play it. Go over to Apple Podcasts, give us a rating and review. We would really appreciate it. And of course, follow us on the social media outlets. You can find us at the Jedi Masters on X. And you can, of course, find the network at Joy Nerd Party on X and the Nerd Party on Facebook and Instagram. And we're far too lazy for TikTok still. So, Matt, like we were dropping a hint, I'm going to surprise you with a topic. This is a weird one that was sort of baking in my brain for a little bit. On the Death Star, we've gotten Rogue One now, where we see it's just completed. And we all know that Princess Leia gets captured and she's put in the detention block on the Death Star. Mm-hmm. My question for you is two-part. One, were there any other political prisoners on the Death Star that were therefore incinerated when the rebels blew it up? And two, were they obligated to try to discover if there were additional prisoners and try to break them out as part of their destruction mission?
I am tempted to think that there were not. And mainly because Rogue One shows us, I think, some of the first action of the Death Star. And since Rogue One's end leads right into Star Wars' beginning, I don't think there was another place for the Death Star to have gone and or a political prisoner to have been transferred to the Death Star at this point. It does seem like you would still be bringing political prisoners to, Coruscant or somewhere else. We saw in the Bad Batch, Admiral Rampart put on a work colony of the Empire. And so those types of places seem to be the places you would find some type of prisoner like that. I don't really think the Death Star would be the place for those people. And it also seems like, too, and this is just conjecture, but, when you see them looking through, they're like trying to figure out what cell she's in, it doesn't really seem like that there's anybody else in there. It's more like they're trying to find out which cell they've put somebody in, and it's like the only cell that's occupied seems to be hers. And so that would be my answer to that question, because I just get the feeling like the Death Star is too new at this point, especially with the storyline that we got from Rogue One, that you really haven't had the opportunity for that to happen just yet.
Okay. Fair. I think that's a very fair read. I would counter it by saying, while the Death Star is being constructed, you could make the argument that there were political prisoners on Vader's Star Destroyer And when he showed up at it, they decided to drop them off, as part of a transfer program.
Sure.
Obviously, I think it's an uncomfortable thing to think that there are other prisoners in there that they didn't spring out. I mean, just for the sake of getting Leia out, springing other prisoners as distraction tactics that seems like an Andor show, honestly, the type of thing that they would go with that. But in those terms, I think it's accurate to say that there probably were no other prisoners, but then fine, let me peel another layer off there, because there is the second part to it, but let's have sort of a sub part of part one here. If she was the very first one to be put on to the Death Star as a prisoner of any sort, then why was the cell block so staffed up? Don't you think they could have gotten away with one guy on duty instead of having a whole bunch of people on duty? Or did they just figure everybody would be bored? And they were like, I don't know, go stand in the cell block or something like that. Prep for when we bring all of the prisoners in.
I actually feel like it's that thing where there isn't anything for these characters to do, these people to do yet on the Death Star. It's so new. There's trying to figure out the running of the Death Star, itself and who's needed where. I mean, gosh, the guys that are on duty, making sure that people aren't in restricted areas don't really seem that interested in making sure that's the case. They're not doing a great job of that, right? And so I think that these detention block guys are the kind of the same way. They've got one prisoner to guard. They're super bored. There's no Dejarik board in there for them. And they're really just waiting for their calf break. The possible underworld, spice dealer, janitor that's going to give them their fix for the rest of the week.
Well, but again, in all honesty, as we sit here, we're thinking through it and everything. Doesn't staffing up the detention block on the Death Star seem really silly to begin with, right? Because, okay, we have a couple of troopers march you down there. We throw you in a cell. We close the door. Peace. We're out. Do you really need any more than one person standing there? Because even if somebody escapes somehow and overpowers that one person on duty, where the hell are they going to go? They have no idea where they are in relation to anywhere else on this entire moon-sized battle station. They have tons of stormtroopers around, but I mean, I don't know. Am I answering my own question in my head right now, thinking, yes, but Han, Luke, Leia, and Chewie waltz around the Death Star with impunity, armed, mind you, in no semblance of military clothing or armor. So maybe it is easier to sneak around the Death Star than I thought, right? Those four scamps got up to a whole lot of trouble.
Well, this is the thing that I do think is a really interesting question, right? Because I do think that the Death Star is this massive thing, right? And it always, in some ways, does make me wonder, exactly why it's so big, and if really most of it is taken up with the machinery for creating, this massive planet-destroying laser. And then, of course, the hyperspace engines needed to fling this thing through hyperspace, right? You would expect that both of those types of technologies would need to be incredibly big to get something as large as a moon, basically, a small moon, through hyperspace, and then to power this type of laser. And so, and I think, yeah, I mean, I know they've done the cross sections of the Death Star and those cross section books and everything. And it seems to have 42 million decks to it and everything. But, it does seem like that so much of the Death Star, I mean, even think of when they go to the elevators, the space elevators, and there's just that section and it just drops off. And it just seems like a big part of the Death Star as well is kind of hollow. There's a lot of space that isn't filled. And so, the engineering of the Death Star itself seems to be a little bit nebulous. It feels like a lot of wasted material went into this place. And in some ways, though, I do think this was meant to be the Imperial battle station that moved, and, you could house Star Destroyers. It was going to be the type of place you could, have, ships come in for maintenance and all that kind of stuff as well. And so,
well, yeah, I mean, the thing is, in my head, right, I loved the cross-section books. I think they're amazing. But in my head, basically the Death Star, if you will, is sort of like an egg where the shell is a certain thickness and everybody sort of exists in the shell, who's the day-to-day operations of everything. And then you have this core. You have to be capable of docking a Star Destroyer in there, right? You have to, or more than one Star Destroyer. You have to be capable of docking all of these things in. We've seen the scale, how much larger it is than even the Super Star Destroyer.
Sure.
And so I would say there has to be a ton of empty space. And just as we're sitting here talking about it, I would argue that you would also need a ton of empty space just to keep people as far away from whatever radiation is being emitted from the core. Otherwise, you're going to have people, your staff is going to have to be frequently replenished.
I don't know. Those guys just stand right next to the laser beam as it comes out, as it joins with the other laser beams. And I feel like their life expectancy is at like 0 every time that happens.
I will go ahead and let's write some headcanon right now that every time we see another shot of those guys in there, I think we see one with Death Star 2, and then I think it's 1 or 2 with in the original one. I can't recall the whole. I apologize. I know I'm not a real fan. I can't recall every single shot in my head right now. But I would say
you're not
that
a real fan. So
no, not at all.
We'll
I would
apologize.
say that,
we're so sorry. We'll stop doing a Star Wars podcast, everyone.
I would say that every time you see a new shot, it's 2 new people. Like one blast and they die. Like they're just they're basically just fried corpses at the end of it. And that's the end of it for them. But it's a glorious moment, right? They're actually sitting there hoping, oh, please let the rebels capitulate. Don't fire the gun. Don't fire the, can you imagine the 2 guys that get called? Like this feels like something you would see on that Star Wars Detours sort of thing. Like they the guys get fried every time it fires off. And then they're like, okay, Johnson, Miller, you're next. And it's like, but I don't want to go man the laser.
Yeah, exactly. Well,
that sort of thing.
I mean, looking at the cross sections too, there is an incredible amount of this that is just housing machinery, right? And the different reactors needed to power this thing. But at the same time, like we said, this is also a place that was meant to be something that was a way to take care of this massive star fleet, and I think be a place where you could have, Star Destroyers fixed, in the Outer Rim if needed, without them having to come home, and all of that kind of stuff. And so I do think, and you get the sense, especially with the first Death Star in the original Star Wars, that this is something that they don't have it all figured out yet, and everything is just kind of running a little bit, maybe lackadaisical is the word.
I had not considered the possibility of repair crews on the Death Star. I'm glad you, seriously, at no point have I ever thought to myself, well, if they're going to have Star Destroyers and such in there, they need repair crews. They need large numbers of repair crews in there. So basically, maybe the majority of the staff on the Death Star really is just maintenance people. It seems like maybe not, but it seems like it would need room for that. But I come back again, as we're talking about these large maintenance crews and servicing Star Destroyers and TIE Fighters and all of these different sorts of things, because obviously the TIE Fighters aren't just sitting in Star Destroyers. They have them ready to scramble straight out of the bays. I come back to the detention block, because isn't the detention block pointless in the era of the Death Star? Like, whose information are you going to squeeze out? How long is it possibly going to take Vader, or anyone else for that matter, to squeeze enough information out of somebody to know what planet to eradicate, or if you're willing to blow up an important world like Alderaan just as a show of force, just the suspicion of rebellion is enough for you to fry the planet, right? Like, is a detention block even serving a real purpose within the context of the Death Star?
I think that the reason that the detention block exists on the Death Star is that there are going to be times where they are going to be taking, political prisoners. They are going to be taking people to which they're trying to get information out of, and or they're maybe just transporting. Like they can't be seen, willingly killing these people. And so they bring them on the detention block. They get what information they can out of them, and then they, do away with them maybe later on. So I could see the reason why this exists. I think there's always a reason to have a place to hold prisoners for many different reasons, and I think. The Death Star is meant to be a place that deters people from doing things that they shouldn't, by destroying planets. But at the same time, it's also this massive enforcement thing where I think you could just be taking a certain amount of prisoners with you and bringing them to work camps, right? And that kind of thing. You take enough of the population away, and it could be something that deters the population then from rising up against the Empire. And so, I definitely see the reason for, having the detention block for that reason as well. So I think there's a few different reasons why you would have it. It does seem to be kind of like a long block, but they got a lot of space to fill up.
Let me give you a horrifying possibility here too, because apparently, they're willing to put people to death. They're willing to torture people. They're willing to put them in cells and everything. We all know that the Death Star would also have to have some sort of recycling program. They have a garbage chute, yes, but they also have a lot of people to feed. Is it possible that these detention cells could also serve as the means to Soylent Green prisoners up from time to time to serve them to the staff of the Death Star? Because we've often talked on the program about the fact that one of Palpatine's power moves is to create more darkness in the galaxy. And what is more horrid than basically taking the bodies of your enemies and feeding them to your staff, right? And the staff doesn't need to know. It's not like they're sitting there and they're like, oh, hey, we got some Wookiees in last week. It's going to be good eating tonight, right? Like, I'm talking about, like, yes, I'm offering it as a joke, but I'm also thinking in terms of, like, if they have these prisoners on there, what if somebody dies on board? Do you just toss them in the garbage compactor, or do they have some other more hideous fate in store for them?
I was thinking actually that the Death Star probably has to have some sort of hydroponics bay. And, to have food for this amount of people, right? They probably have to have some kind of way of creating food like that.
Although, it was cut out of the Phantom Menace, although you can still see a vestige of it with Qui-Gon reaching underneath his robes into one of his supply pouches when they first get to Anakin's home. They did have pills that could turn into food.
Sure, and we see that, of course, in episode 7. We also see that in Kenobi.
Yeah.
So those are places where we actually see that kind of play out as well. But I get the feeling like the Empire, in its arrogance, would be somebody who, one of the reasons for wanting to join the Empire was maybe that they gave you better food. It's one of the few ways maybe they cared for their people. So I could see that being the case. That would be pretty interesting. And again, you just got all the space in the Death Star. I can't imagine, some sort of massive hydroponics bay on one of the lower levels isn't a part of the Death Star.
Well, one of the inner one, maybe closer to the core, it's giving off some sort of enough some sort of energy that they can convert into something that would enable plants to grow.
Sure.
That sort of thing. Maybe another, since it could go from place to place, maybe they just planned to fly over to a planet, suck it dry of its resources, and then blow it up so nobody could prove the horror of what they did, or, would they really care? I mean, they touched on that in the original Ahsoka book. We've touched on that in a couple of things, where the reason there are so many desert planets is because the Empire has stripped them of their resources completely and just left them as empty husks in their wake. But setting that aside, let's come back to part 2 of the question, which is, if there were political prisoners on there, just for the sake of argument, there was even so much as one other one than Leia, did they have an obligation to try to free those prisoners before they blew up the Death Star? Like, let's say Dodonna's sitting there, and simultaneously, as he figures out, hey, there's this flaw in it, there's no way to get in to exploit it, but here's this thing which we could use to exploit the flaw that was built into it and the reactor. And he discovers a file along the way where he goes, oh no, there could be 10 people on there that are innocent. Did the rebels have an obligation to hold off on destroying the Death Star until they try to get those people out?
I don't think so. And I think that we can take lessons from history, especially when you think of, bombing campaigns in World War II, and those type of things. When you think about the destructive power of the Death Star and what it could do and what it could bring on the galaxy, I think the collateral damage of a few political prisoners is a small price to pay for billions upon billions upon billions of people that you're saving by this thing being destroyed. And I think that even those political prisoners would probably agree. And so, especially if they were ones fighting the Empire. And so, I think that's something that we often forget. There are things that are worth dying for, and that's one of the lessons of Star Wars, right? To get philosophical for a second, I think that's one of the keys to Star Wars, that there are things that are worth giving our life for. Values, there are ideas, and freedom itself, right? Here in America, as we're recording, we just had Memorial Day, where we remember those who gave their lives for the freedoms that we enjoy here in the United States. And we remember them because they were willing to make that ultimate sacrifice. And, I think that's one of the beauties of the things that we've been seeing in the Star Wars series, as they've been exploring the depths of the dark times with the Empire. Those that were willing to rise up and do what it took, even if it took their own death. I think the Andor series does that. I think the Bad Batch series does that. Rebels, of course, does that. You've got all of these series that are showing us. It's not just that we give our lives for the cause, but these people are giving their lives for people they don't even know. To have freedom. And I think there's something incredibly beautiful in that. And so that would be my really philosophical answer to that question of whether or not saving those people was okay.
Well, I agree with you specifically because in the cause of rebellion in Star Wars, you can easily make the argument that, to your point about these people agreeing about their sacrifice being appropriate, when they joined the rebellion against the Empire, they knew that death was a possible outcome.
Exactly.
And if they were willing to go on missions that led to their potential capture and death, then even if you don't send them a message explaining it beforehand, they would be of a mindset to say, oh, you have to blow this thing up to save everybody else. Well, I would have done that. That's why I was out there fighting.
Right.
Uncle
Right.
Owen would not have been happy about the decision,
Right.
but Uncle Owen most likely was not going to end up in a detention block on the Death Star because he didn't want anything to do with what was going on. It's so far away from here. That's not my fight. It's not anything that I want anything to do with. I'm just going to live my life in
Exactly.
in the manner that I can, which in and of itself, I mean, that's a whole other philosophical thing we've explored before too, but you can't fault Owen for feeling that, hey, I'm pretty advanced in age. There's not much I can do physically to go out there and do these sorts of things from Tatooine.
Well, and I
His
think
nephew
that
notwithstanding.
I think that that's also one of those things, you think of Rogue One specifically, right? And I know you don't love the beginning, but that's one of the places where I think that the conundrum then that Andor faces, right? Do I kill this guy and get away so they can bring this information to the rebellion with the hope of saving the entire galaxy? And those are the type of questions that we're asking. Right. And that are being asked, I think, in these series that we're watching. And even that Star Wars itself, in its small way, does bring up. And that's what makes this, I think, a series that continues, that people keep going back to, because I think there's so much to mine. And George knew that. And it's something that I think we're all very aware of as we watch this series.
Well, I definitely want to say that, especially with part 2 of the question, where we're talking about whether the political prisoners would agree with it, the idea of innocence or good guys being on board the Death Star at the time. I remember specifically an old expanded universe book, I believe it was called Children of the Jedi, where there was a character that advanced this idea. And if I'm getting the title wrong, I know there was a book, though, where Luke encountered someone who said specifically he was responsible for the deaths of people who were simply in the Empire. Basically, it was a big equivocation where it was, it gets back to the whole clerks argument about like, oh, those contractors knew what was going on when they were working on the Death Star sort of thing. But the idea was that, well, only Tarkin and Vader were really the most evil ones on there, and a couple of the generals. Everybody else was just doing their job. And I'm sure that it's not as simple as I'm portraying it, but I remember bristling at it at the time because this character was laying a heavy guilt trip on Luke about it. And I was saying basically what you and I are saying here, which is like, well, what were they supposed to do? Let the Death Star blow up Yavin 4 and basically end the rebellion at that moment? That's worse. That's actually a worse outcome for everybody. And it's like, I'm sorry that I feel that way sometimes, I guess, because like I can sort of see it, but at the same time, I see it as a hideous over rationalization of everything to sit there and think that the rebels in that moment had any other choice at all.
Right. Exactly.
That would be like saying, at the Battle of Endor, they should not have blown up the Super Star Destroyer because there was a janitor on deck 412 that was just there making ends meet. And it's like, I mean, I know it seems heartless. I know there will be people that bristle at this, but you can't avoid it in a situation like that.
Yeah.
And that, that's why you have people that are making those decisions and they have sleepless nights. They're not happy about it. Well, the only people who would be happy about it are the bad guys because they're monsters and they don't care.
Yeah, exactly. Well, look, I think that this is the thing that is so important about this whole discussion is that in the end and it comes directly from the Harry Potter series, Dumbledore says this, I believe, to Harry as they're talking, and he says, there are things worse than death when he's talking about Voldemort. I believe it's in their conversations in the Half-Blood Prince. And, I think that that's such an incredibly interesting thing. And I think that's also, in some ways, the way in which the Star Wars universe sees the world, right? That there are things worse than death. I really appreciate the way in which, um, you know, we talk about these issues. And it's one of the great things about Star Wars that we can have these really in-depth conversations, right? About things that seem silly, but they lead to big conversations, and that's the greatness of this series when it's done well, and so it also makes me excited for all the things that hopefully are to come in Star Wars that lead us to more conversations.
At the end of the day, it's the classic discussion of good versus evil, and at what point do you go too far in one direction or the other before things get blurred and the responsibility of your actions becomes too weighty. Because I honestly think that there is an argument to say that the Jedi Order itself winds up backed into this terrible bureaucratic role that they have, specifically because it would have been, I could project myself further back in time and say that they tried the complete non-involvement route because they didn't want to make these difficult calls because they felt it wasn't true to their calling. And then they realized that that was the place that chaos came from, without them taking any sort of direct action and all the, well, anyway, while we could debate these sorts of things until we are green in the face, Matt, if anybody wants to discuss the merits of the Death Star's inner workings or how many cell blocks they may have had on board, because we know that Princess Leia was on cell block AA-23. Does that mean there was an AA-01 through 22? Were there 100 AAs sprinkled throughout the Death Star? And was it possibly just when a stormtrooper got drunk, that's what they were really built for, to throw them in the
That's what I
brig?
was going to ask too. Is this really just where we have our meetings for the stormtroopers?
Yeah, right. Somebody gets in a brawl in the mess hall.
Exactly.
They throw a few troopers in there, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
But then going sort of in the Simpsons route with the Treehouse of Horror episode that they had, if you have repeat offender stormtroopers, those are the ones that get turned into the food for the mess hall. And, they just get put into a big blender and thrown through and everything. I mean, it's a great way to reduce, reuse, and recycle. But if people want to reach out, rediscuss, and rediscover certain things with you online, Matt, where can they find you?
Well, reach out and touch someone on social media under the name MattRushing02. You can find me all over the place. You can also find me here on the network with Owl Post, talking about every chapter of the Harry Potter series, one chapter at a time, with Drea Kaufman. Over on the TFM network, you'll find me doing a bunch of shows. One is a general geek show talking about all of the franchises that we love. And John is a frequent guest over there, so you can check that out. We've got some great crossovers, too, as we've been talking about some recent Star Wars editions. You can also find me over on the TFM network on shows like Literary Treks, The Orb, Warp 5, The Artificial Tango, and Saddle Up. But John, where can people find you?
Well, gosh, you can't find me anywhere because I'm more an idea than a person. But if you chant the name Kessel Junkie online, I will manifest myself in various different ways. But you can also find me co-hosting a show here on the network called House Lights, where we look at the work of directors. I'm still campaigning for House of Neil Breen, but, it's an ongoing conversation. And like you said, I love doing the crossover episodes with you over on the 602 Club, and I can't wait to discuss for Snyder Cuts the completely renamed, not special editions, longer R-rated cuts of Rebel Moon, which I sincerely hope are better. I think that's the official title. I think that's the official title.
I hope they're better. Yes, yeah. I think that's exactly
Rebel
what
Moon
they're called.
Part 1 could be improved. Rebel Moon Part 2, please let this be watchable. So now that I've angered every possible Snyder fan in existence that's listening right now, I love him, guys. I love him, okay? I was just disappointed. You can go ahead and count on us to be setting the old DVR. Ooh, does anybody still have those? Setting the old DVR to catch all of the past Star Wars shows that were aired on network television back in the day. back at the temple. So, Master Rushing, I believe it is time to close these negotiations.
John, negotiations are closed.
Join the revolution. Join the Nerd Party.